So, so if everybody else will mute and hide, I will launch. Here we go. Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to ANC 3-4G's Information Exchange Series. And the topic tonight is small area plans in historic districts. My name is Charles Cadwell. I'm a new ANC commissioner for single member district 3G07. I've been in this job less than 2 months. The commission's been organizing a whole series of information exchanges over the last year related to the Chevy Chase small area plan process, which, as I suspect everybody who's with us tonight knows, is being led by the District of Columbia's Office of Planning. I'm joined tonight in hosting this event by my ANC colleague, Connie Chang, who's helping manage the Zoom webinar and has organized most, if not all, of the prior information exchange events. This series just began last spring with addressing the question of why and what for a small area plan. And then this past fall shifted more into the how and the where. The prior sessions addressed everything from affordable housing development models to the uses of the 2 public buildings on Connecticut Avenue and other issues of interest to neighbors as the small area plan develops. Michael, we're putting everybody on camera and mic off. So tonight's session is 75 minutes long, and we're going to address 3 questions, among others. First of all, what aspects of the look and feel of Connecticut Avenue can be addressed by the small area plan? And what aspects might require a historic district? Second would be what considerations would affect the scope and the details of any historic district? And finally, what are the effects of historic district designation on other neighborhood goals, such as increased density or affordable housing and/or areas outside the designated area? Tonight's event is co-sponsored by both the Chevy Chase Citizens Association and Historic Chevy Chase DC. And their presidents, Robert Gordon and Carl Lankowski, are with us and will join the discussion after a little bit to press their own questions and in advance of us opening the floor to audience members. We have 3 experts with us tonight. Steve Callcott, who's the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer and has a longish career now, more than 2 decades, I think, with the Historic Preservation Office, and has worked with other parts of the city who have had both different forms of development plans and/or historic districts. His colleague, Kim Williams, also joins us. She's the Historic Preservation Specialist, and I know from all of her work up here in our part of the city, knows a whole lot about the Chevy Chase history and issues. And finally, Brian McCabe, who's an associate professor at Georgetown University, and with several others has authored a series of articles on the effects of a historic district in New York City, and I believe maybe some other cities, but not Washington, DC. So we're hoping his work can provide us some insight about what we're facing here. But before we begin, some logistics. This meeting is being done via Zoom webinar, so the audience is muted and off screen unless we promote someone to be a panelist. So as we proceed, I urge you to use the Q&A function on your screen to post questions for the panel, and we will use those to ask questions. Of course, there's also a chat button you can see there, and you should feel free to use that as well. Both the chat and the Q&A will be saved at the end of the session and added to our website along with the recording of this event. On our website, you can also see the recordings of the 7 prior information exchanges. So with that, let me invite our panel to join me on the screen. Brian, Steve, Kim. Great, thank you all and welcome. Thank you for taking time tonight. I know you all have day jobs. Connie, I think it might declutter the screen some if you could move some of our colleagues to the to audience members.
Okay, I will
Thank you.
do that.
My screen is cluttered, and I want to give these handsome people plenty of visibility. But thank you all three for joining us. I wanted to, by way of framing a question for you, suggest that I think most of us agree that cities have lots of goals, and all of those goals reflect legitimate interests in each of them. The district has affordable housing goals, and most people I know in Chevy Chase think that we ought to be part of the solution to that. Many of us are concerned that Connecticut Avenue be a more vibrant urban streetscape, a more active east side for sure, and fewer empty storefronts on the west. Many of us are concerned we have our own history that makes us concerned about the legacy of decades of racial exclusion. And we also care about the character of the neighborhood's architecture and amenities. And I think if people have been with us over the prior 7 events, you're probably assured now that a small area plan is coming. And so the issue of what's in it is still with us. And also later this year, the district is going to begin steps to renovate the 2 public properties on Connecticut Avenue, the library and the community center. So we face some complex choices. Which of these goals is more important to the city? Which is more important to the community? How much can they be aligned? And what role does the small area plan and/or historic district have in advancing any of those goals? And before we dive in, I want to also say that in addition to being on the ANC now, I've been involved with Historic Chevy Chase for a decade. And as many of you know, Historic Chevy Chase a decade ago or more proposed a historic district that raised a significant amount of opposition. Indeed, about 70% of our neighbors voted against it in a poll that the ANC conducted at the time. Times have changed, and there's new interest in a historic district up here, which is one of the reasons I wanted to convene this session. In the context of today's consideration of the SAP, there's a lot of questions about how the two work together or do not. So maybe just to back up a little bit, what I've learned over the last few months is that the SAP and the historic district are both sort of different mechanisms. They're not identical types of land use planning. And so I wonder, Kim or Steve, if you could give us the basics of the role each of them plays in land use planning and regulation of neighborhoods, sort of a 101 to get us all on the same page.
Okay. Yeah, so obviously a small area plan, as the community has been learning, is a specific targeted assessment of an area, and it usually has specific goals in mind of what it's looking at and what it's trying to achieve. The Office of Planning has been doing small area plans since roughly 2000, 2001. They, as I say, they're sort of looking to assess an area obviously in Chevy Chase with the goal of stimulating the commercial area specifically, and the creation of housing, and specifically affordable housing, and then looking at the civic structures with a little bit more depth, because those are the properties that the city controls. And which we think we can have probably the most direct impact on their redevelopment. And again, as I think has been coming out as part of the public outreach in the small area plan, it makes a series of recommendations. Those recommendations are not necessarily self-fulfilling. They will often be recommendations for rezoning to take place, for design guidelines, either regulatory guidelines or advisory guidelines to be established. And can also identify whether or not there are historic resources that should be considered as part of the overall consideration of the redevelopment of an area.
Can I interrupt you right there, though, Steve? Those recommendations vis-a-vis the historic don't have the same effect as a historic district, though.
Correct, right. They can just acknowledge which the language in the draft language in the small area plan for Chevy Chase is already doing, that people feel that there is value, architectural, historic value to the specifically the west side of Connecticut Avenue, the 3 blocks there, that should be taken into consideration, whether or not it recommends a specific creation of an historic district or just acknowledges that we have heard that there is interest in retaining the essential character of that area, whether that's done through, but the only real way that can be done is through the creation of an historic district. Other than that, it would just be sort of advisory of like, yeah, we like it, but unless there's a regulatory mechanism put into place to protect it and to guide change to it that establishes that it has historic value and it has characteristics that people want to retain. That's what an historic district does. So an historic district is created through a designation process in which an argument is laid out for why the area is significant, identifies the buildings that contribute to that sense of history as well as the ones that do not. And one thing that our office has ensured that we do with any new historic districts over the past 10 or 12 years is that at the same time an historic district is being proposed, that we develop design guidelines that are specific to how that historic district would be treated, that establishes, again, sort of what are the protected and not protected buildings, what are the characteristics that are important to retain, and how can you alter and add and infill in that historic district in a way that is specific to the characteristics of that area.
So I might glom on.
Yeah, go ahead, Kim. Thank you.
Thanks to what Steve was saying. And in terms of the process, obviously we have to have an application to our office that we would review. It would then go to the Historic Preservation Review Board for evaluation and determination of whether it meets the criteria. But I would say that that Chevy Chase has already really begun this process. I mean, many years ago, you've already collected a lot of the history, you've documented the buildings, and you have already addressed the criteria for designation. And the Historic Preservation Office has already determined that Chevy Chase is eligible as a historic district. So part of that process is already in the works. Obviously, a nomination would have to be updated with new information and amended somewhat to address new information that's come to light, much of what Historic Chevy Chase has uncovered in recent years. But in terms of the eligibility, and that is also acknowledged in the small area plan, that Chevy Chase has been determined eligible as a historic district. So I think that's important for everybody to know that this is a public process. It starts at the community level, is community driven, but from a technical perspective, we do recognize that Chevy Chase is an eligible historic district.
Most of us who live in the neighborhood here in Chevy Chase moved here, well, for several reasons, I'm sure, but among them was the way the place looked and feels. And so I think and I think many people recognize at the same time that we need to change and keep up with the times. But one of the frustrations with the small area plan is that people aren't quite clear what it's going to do and not going to do yet. I understand it's still being drafted by your colleagues in the Office of Planning. And so that uncertainty is what I think has caused a lot of concern. But the process you described where you write these guidelines, are those written in a public way as well? Because, a lot of the opposition 10 years ago, and I have no idea what it would be today, was about the gritty details of what was going to be allowed and not allowed, and the same as concerns about windows.
Right.
Absolutely. I mean, there will be a public process. I mean, obviously there are guidelines and standards for historic preservation that we have to follow, but there would be a lot of public input in terms of some of the details or some of the specifics about what are character defining features, or what's really important to people versus other aspects. But ultimately, we would be generating the guidelines and putting them out to the community for comment, and then we would respond to comments. But it would be a document that would come, from our office.
Right, and that's part of, and that's after you've accepted the designation, or is that part of the designation?
Kind of a combination. I mean, so
Okay.
if goes to a hearing and it's approved, then we would be working towards those historic district guidelines pretty much, immediately after the designation.
Right.
We
So
would
the-
want
We usually do the guidelines when the designation application has been submitted and prior to hearing, because there's always a lot of public education that goes around,
Right.
because people always have questions about what are the implications of this for me as a property owner, and the design guidelines are a way for us to put in writing, okay, this is what the treatment would be. These would be the allowable treatments. You could do this, you can't do that, so that it makes the process a little bit more transparent as to what the implications of it would be. And so in our past 10 or so years of designations of new historic districts, we have put the design guidelines forward to the review board at the same time as the historic district application. So although the board doesn't typically act on them at the same time, but we put those out there as part of the public record so that, again, people can comment on both the application and whether they think that it meets the criteria for designation and something they support or not, but they also have a clear understanding of what the implications of designation would be if it were to be designated, and comment on that as well.
Well, yeah, we have so many questions on it, but tell me though, there are a lot of historic districts in Washington. We may have more per capita than many other cities. And you said there are several small area plans. Do any of them overlap? Are there places where there's both a small area plan and a historic district?
Yeah, there are a number of them. The very first small area plan that was done back in, I think it was 2001, 2002, was Tacoma Park, the Tacoma Park Central District. It was really looking at just the commercial area in the same way that we are in Chevy Chase. That was a pre-existing historic district. Tacoma Park's been designated since the 1970s. Although the commercial area was kind of rough in terms of not having a tremendous number of historic buildings. It's really more the residential area. And that small area plan obviously acknowledged the existence of the historic district and the importance of preserving the existing historic buildings that were in the commercial area. It made relatively modest recommendations in terms of zoning changes. It specifically adjusted the allowable height for commercial buildings to allow for a slightly higher retail base. It capped the height at 50 feet, so it raised it to 55 feet so we could get a better retail frontage for new construction. There are other historic district or other small area plans that have acknowledged the existence of historic resources. And either acknowledge that there was community interest in seeking designation, or just that there were historic resources that should be considered in a more general way. The Mount Vernon Triangle Historic District, which is just a little area that's just east of the convention center, was an area that the Office of Planning studied back in 2007, 8 maybe. And that small area plan was really looking at an area that had very high density zoning, could allow for 110-foot buildings. But there was a real interest in establishing a unique sense of place to that area. And placemaking was talked about a lot in that small area plan. But the Office of Planning struggled with what tools it had to encourage placemaking. And so ultimately, it turned to the Historic Preservation Office, and there were only a handful of historic buildings there, not very many. But there were strict, enough to create a small historic district. And that plan ultimately led to the creation of a small historic district with the goal of not limiting the development on the sites of the historic buildings, which are very, very small scale, but acknowledging that this area should be redeveloped to its full potential, but that those historic buildings provided the opportunity for perhaps creating a little bit more a unique sense of place, which through some of the projects that have been executed since then have done that. Similarly, the Florida Avenue Market, very different resource than Chevy Chase, of course. But that small area plan similarly identified the historic core of the 1930s market complex as a really unique resource that had the potential for continuing to serve as a wholesale market, but also evolving into more of a retail and restaurant area. So it created a plan that incentivized a density on the perimeter of the historic core, which is very low scale, and discourages the density within the historic core, because we didn't want to create conflicts between residential uses being put into what's essentially sort of an entertainment and still a wholesale market zone. And there are others as well that look at the specifics of the historic resources and issues involved.
Super, thank you. I've got a jillion questions, but I want to turn to Brian if I can. Brian, you may live here, but your research has been about New York City, which is a very different city than Washington, and certainly different than Chevy Chase, Washington, where we're very low density and low profile, and the development potential is different. But nonetheless, you looked at, in your study with several others, or more than one study, I guess, but you looked at the effects of historic designation on affordability, on housing prices, on density, and some other issues. But and these are lengthy peer-reviewed articles with lots of math in them, so I don't suggest you get into that this evening. But for those of us who are civilians, what did you study and what did you find? The reason I'm glad you're with us tonight is because I've, as long ago as when we did 12, 13 years ago, whenever it was, we proposed a historic district, I've been trying to find research on exactly these topics. And so I'm thrilled to have stumbled across you.
Yeah, great, thanks, Chaz. So let me just share, I guess, a little bit of background on our work, and I think sort of how it might be helpful or apply to this conversation. So as Chaz mentioned, our work is on New York City, obviously a very different city, although I think it's worth keeping in mind that, New York is also a city of 5 boroughs, and Queens and much of Brooklyn and Staten Island look a lot more like places like Chevy Chase or some other low density parts of DC, of course, than downtown Manhattan. But it is true that, right, New York is different than other places for a lot of reasons. And one way that New York is different in terms of the historical context or historic districts is that in New York, about 3% of parcels, or about 3% of properties, are part of a historic district. Whereas in DC, my understanding is that it's closer to about 20%, right? So in other words, a lot more land in DC sort of falls under a historic district than in New York. So just sort of keeping in mind, I think, some of those differences. But I think where our work can sort of help to inform, or at least offer some things to think about in this conversation. So we basically have 2 lines of research that we were interested in. The first is to think about the impact of historic preservation on property values, whether or not property values go up after a neighborhood is designated. And then the second is to think about demographic change, whether the composition of people living in a neighborhood changes after a district is designated. And research like this is sort of done in the aggregate, right? So it's impossible to say, of course, that what we find on average in New York is what will happen in Chevy Chase, right? Or there's a lot of differences across neighborhoods in New York. So what I'm sort of talking about here, and what how social scientists talk about this, is kind of like an average effect of what's going on. So I just don't want to sort of misconstrue our findings and think, when I say property values go up, you can expect that property value bump in Chevy Chase, right? It may not be the case. So, but just sort of generally on our work, I mean, this is what we find. So on the property value question, we do find that property values go up after the designation of a historic district, right? And that's in comparison to sort of similar neighborhoods, similar properties that aren't yet or aren't designated as a historic district. And we can imagine, several reasons why this is the case. Historic designation kind of affirms that the placemaking, the image of the community will stay sort of standard, right? That in, at least in the New York case, you won't have big buildings and neighborhood changes. There may be some social status associated with living in a historic district, right? People want to live in these kinds of districts. Particularly people that have more money to spend might value the sort of historic amenities that come with the designation of historic district. It may make it more difficult to build affordable housing or to build any kind of housing, right? As a land use restriction, it may restrict the kind of housing or the amount of housing that's built in a neighborhood. And when we limit the supply of housing in a neighborhood, right, prices go up. So, the kind of general finding, and this is the one thing that quite a few researchers have studied, and generally the finding is quite similar across cities. To my knowledge, there hasn't been work directly on this in DC, although Stephen can please correct me if I'm wrong, if there's other research that I'm not aware of. But across a number of cities, there's kind of generally a finding of a positive price bump in housing prices after historic designation. On the demographic side, sort of thinking about the composition of neighborhoods and what neighborhoods look like, I mean, the sort of thing to just note, I think, is that this is a very kind of long-term process, right? The process of residential change, people moving in and out of neighborhoods, having access and opportunity to neighborhoods or being restricted from them, that happens over many decades, right? So in our research, I mean, the first historic districts in New York are in the late 1960s. So we have some sort of evidence over many decades. But we do find that the population of white residents increases after the designation of historic district, again, on average in New York. We found that the poverty rate, the number of families living in poverty, goes down. The poverty rate, I'm sure, in Chevy Chase is relatively low to begin with. We find that the kind of characteristics often associated with higher income or higher socioeconomic status families moving in, right? And this, I think, is sort of consistent with the price story. So the other piece of the puzzle that we think a lot about in our work is just to note that right, all these land use decisions that happen in a single neighborhood sort of affect what goes on in other places in the city as well. So one of the things that we talk about in a paper on housing affordability is that historic preservation, right, by restricting the supply of housing in New York, making it more difficult to build new buildings, or even in some neighborhoods, taking kind of multifamily properties and turning them back into single family homes, things like that. It may make it more difficult for people to find housing, to build affordable housing. And this sort of has an impact citywide, right? So one of the things that we talk about, and I think could be part of a planning process, is thinking about kind of the number of units or the amount of density that's restricted because of historic preservation, and thinking about sort of upzoning or changing zoning in other places to ensure that those sort of units aren't lost citywide. But generally, Chaz, that's sort of what our work is about. On one hand, thinking about kind of demographic composition of neighborhoods, and the other about property value increases.
In one of the papers you had, you also looked at racial diversity in historic districts. And I think that, to me, given your findings on income, the findings were surprising, and that you found less change, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, so we find that the white population increases, but there's no significant change in the Black population in neighborhoods. So, and it's there are some sort of methodological reasons for that. I mean, part of it is the data we use, census data. Oh, well, the big part of it is perhaps is that cities have become much more diverse since the 1970s and 80s, right? And the sort of racial groups are not simply Black and white families, right? A larger Latino population. That's actually just difficult to measure going back in time. So yeah, that's one of the findings.
It's interesting. So that the other thing, that this may not be the place to get into this, but you had a metrics where you're looking at the development or the density foregone by, and that may have been specific to the kinds of designations in New York.
Right.
Here, we're not talking about allowing 80-story skyscrapers.
Right. So I mean, I think that, when I think about designation, one of the critiques of designation generally that comes up in sort of New York circles is the idea that it's a sort of form of zoning light, right? It's maybe an easier way to get through kind of zoning restrictions or land use restrictions, height or density restrictions. Than through kind of other zoning processes, and that it restricts, right, the amount of development that could happen in a neighborhood. And so, and I come to this as sort of a social scientist who, recognizes both the need to build, right, more affordable housing, the need to build housing. As one of my colleagues, Jenny Schutz, often says, right, we need to build housing in places where people want to live, and you all live in an incredibly desirable neighborhood in Washington, D.C., right? So sort of any restrictions or any further restrictions on housing in a neighborhood like Chevy Chase, right, have implications across the city, right? It makes, when housing is restricted in a neighborhood like Chevy Chase, right, it drives up property values and rent prices in other places as well, because people that would have sort of filtered up to Chevy Chase end up bidding up prices in other neighborhoods. So it has consequences there. But of course, right, it's a balance of also recognizing and valuing the historic architecture and historic character, the place of a neighborhood. And I think sort of as a community trying to figure out where that balance is, right? On one hand, ensuring that, communities sort of have the, sort of their share of housing, of new housing construction, support the plans for new housing construction, and also recognize the historical amenities that make neighborhoods sort of special places that we want to live. So thinking about that balance, I think, is sort of the key to me for a lot of it.
Yeah, so Stephen or Kim, here we're not looking at the choice of restricting heights with a historic designation. I don't think that's really the function of the small area plan and the zoning rules. And so I guess my question is whether if we had a historic district today, with whatever typical guidelines you have adopted in other places, and at the same time, we know from the small area plan pictures that the Office of Planning has shared with us all about what might be permitted under a small area plan. There's a lot more density and volume on Connecticut Avenue. And how do those kinds of increased density, which goes to the volume of housing and maybe the volume of affordable housing, how do those interact with the historic district's design guidelines? If the design guidelines are, it must look like the west side of Connecticut Avenue, it's going to be hard to build a 5 or 6 story apartment block, or not, I don't know.
Right, yeah, and I mean, I think what, just sort of building on what Kim said earlier, we do think that there is an argument to be made for a historic district in Chevy Chase, although as we have talked with you, Chaz, and others, we think that there's sort of a limit to an historic district that's either just the 3 blocks on the west side of Connecticut Avenue, which has the sort of older buildings and enough critical mass to make a case for designation, or the neighborhood would need to look at a much larger neighborhood historic district that would include residential areas that are far outside of the small area plan boundaries, that would create enough critical mass sort of around the east side to sort of justify pulling it in, because there are obviously no buildings on the east side of Connecticut Avenue that warrant designation in and of themselves, we think.
I don't know. That Safeway has lots of admirers.
Well, yeah, nice brick. So I think that if the community is going to pursue this, they need to make a decision as to, okay, are we just going to look at a small commercial historic district, which we think there's justification for, or does it want to undertake the larger effort to convince the broader neighborhood to pull in a much larger historic district and whatever those boundaries might be, which is obviously a lot more work and potentially more contentious. but I think if we're looking at just the commercial area, just the west side of Connecticut Avenue, we're talking about relatively little redevelopment area. I mean, most of the area is already occupied by buildings. We obviously have some parking lots, and we have some buildings that wouldn't be protected as part of the historic district and could be redeveloped. And I think the design guidelines would need to be clear. Again, which buildings are which, and then what are the appropriate treatments? What are the acceptable treatments for infill construction on a vacant or non-historic site? And what are the acceptable treatments on top of some of the historic buildings? Some of those buildings could probably take roof additions to them. So would they go to the full 50 feet or 65 feet under a PUD? Maybe, probably not. They'd probably be a little bit more restricted than that. But there probably is some additional density that could be inserted within that area.
Given those competing objectives, would it matter which comes first, a small area plan or a historic district?
I mean, I think practically the small area plan is moving relatively quickly, and I think the recommendations are probably, the draft is going to come out pretty soon. So not to say that somebody couldn't pull together a historic district application pretty quickly, but they are independent processes. The small area plan is acknowledging already that there is community interest in the west side of Connecticut Avenue in its existing character. And so creating an historic district for those 3 blocks, I think would be consistent with that acknowledgement in the small area plan, and could be accommodated within the goals of the comprehensive of the small area plan. And we just have to develop design guidelines, I think, that acknowledge what could be done there.
Mm-hmm. One of the suggestions I've heard is that, I'm turning to a question for you, I guess, and that is, given that community support and documentation of the proposed historic district is a detailed process, and there's a lot of support for a new historic district, but I don't know that it's at the level that you would find necessary when it all was said and done. Is there any reason that the community couldn't slice the salami one by one and do a narrow historic district to do that strip of Connecticut Avenue that already has 3 historically designated buildings? And then that would be, phase 1, and phase 2 would be the wider, more involving more people, more neighbors, more consultation district second.
Sure. I mean, whether or not phase 2 ever happens or not is contingent on that outreach and that. But creating a commercial historic district would not preclude the community from pursuing a broader historic district in the future.
One of the issues that's come up a lot in the small area plan process is just where's the opportunity for community input, because people are grasping for what's the there. And I think we've overcome some of that with the outreach that Office of Planning has done, including the open house just last week. But, and I guess this may be a question from Brian, but in New York, I don't know that you would have looked at this, but presumably there was public discussion in advance of a historic district, and there must be public reactions post-historic district. Do you have any insight about how people felt beforehand, and whether their people's ambitions or fears were realized, and or any buyer's regret, those sorts of issues?
No, I mean, there's not been, to the best of my knowledge, there's not been sort of work, kind of public opinion or polling work on this. I mean, for the kinds of work that we do, the consequences or the effects are sort of, are long-term effects. I mean, what I will say is, one thing we do know is, and it sounds like this may be true in neighborhoods in DC too. we think about the kind of what groups mobilize for historic preservation. So one of the, more recent designations in New York is in a neighborhood of Bed-Stuy. There's a couple designations as a recent, and they've been districts that have, been on the calendar of the Preservation Commission before, but only sort of once they started to gentrify, kind of once the neighborhood started to change, was there some advocacy and movement around those districts. And so, I think different constituencies bring different concerns to this process, right? So, in some neighborhoods in New York, some historically Black neighborhoods in New York, maybe a mistrust of government or mistrust of the process, perhaps concern that people were going to be priced out of those neighborhoods or that rents were going to go up after designation. Perhaps concerned that low-income homeowners weren't going to be able to keep up with repairs or the requirements of the designation. Sort of led those communities to not always go through the designation process. And on the flip side, sort of after some neighborhoods have started to change, perhaps newcomers, new kind of recent arrivals, people with more cash, looking to protect property values, sort of maybe saw a designation as that kind of tool. So, I can't say for certain on the kind of before or after whether there's buyer's remorse. I mean, right, neighborhoods change really slowly over a long period of time. So it's not really something that, to my knowledge, has been looked at.
Yeah, Stephen or Kim, here in the district, Bloomingdale adopted and has a historic district now, I guess. And at the same time, people in Eckington were proposing one, but there was a there was enough citizen opposition that it did not go forward. What was different? Why did one go forward and one not?
Yeah, I think in Bloomingdale, there was just a really committed group of organizers who were really educating the community about what it meant to be in a historic district. We went out to many meetings to inform them, what it means to be in a historic district, what the implications are. And they just were, it was a very broad-based group of people. They met with and leafleted everybody in the neighborhood. It was a very long process. It took them 2 years, but they wanted to make sure that they reached everybody and that everybody was aware of the process and really understood what it meant. So, they came up against some initial opposition, but they worked through it. And it was just really that organized effort. I think in Eckington, probably the difference was that the organizers just felt a little bit overwhelmed by the initial opposition, and they really didn't want any divisiveness in the neighborhood. They were very cautious about that. And I would say there was probably a racial component to that. They didn't want it to be a white versus Black sort of situation. And so they didn't want to impose designation on a group of people that maybe they perceived didn't want it. And so they pulled back, and yet it was very early in the process when they pulled back. And I also, I think that limited the opportunity to really educate people about what it means to be in a historic district. And many of the people were, under the misconception that they couldn't make any changes to their house whatsoever. And so that was never really made clear to them. Whereas in Bloomingdale, there were so many public meetings and, historic preservation had the opportunity to go out there and answer questions. And, as I said, it was like a 2-year process. But just to get back to something that Brian mentioned, I would say in DC, we actually have kind of a different situation where we're actually having a lot of the old time, longtime residents and property owners, many of whom are people of color, who are looking to designate their neighborhoods as newcomers. Many of them young white professionals are moving in because they want to make sure that they have their history and culture protected. And one of our most recent historic districts, Kingman Park, is in the eastern part of Capitol Hill, right on the edge of the Anacostia River, is a really good example of that, where it was a neighborhood that was established in the 1930s, it was an African-American community built during a time of racial segregation. It was a scene of many important civil rights events and activities. And they really felt that that history was being lost as people were coming in, buying up the houses. And so really we're seeing that not just in Kingman Park, that's not just one example, there are other examples. So maybe that's a new trend, or maybe it's a DC trend, but I just wanted to say that it's definitely the opposite from what you're saying was the trend in New York.
Kim, thank you. We're chewing up our time. I want to invite Carl and Robert to join us. As they're coming in, I want to ask Steve, one conversation we had talked about, we've got these two mechanisms to control land use, the small area plan with the historic district. There are other tools some communities have to control or to regulate development. And I don't know that we have authority to do here in the district, but have been used elsewhere. Can you just briefly talk about some of them?
Yeah. So as you say, we have historic districting. A small area plan typically results in recommendations for zoning changes. And it's through the zoning process that changes to physical form can be enacted in a small area plan area. And it can result in sort of advisory design guidelines that encourages certain types of development or certain types of materials, and the draft for Chevy Chase has sections about that, but that won't carry a regulatory capacity unless that's folded into the zoning regulations themselves. We do have one example in DC, the H Street overlay, which has essentially design some form-based zoning ideas folded into that overlay. It has not been terribly successful. The Board of Zoning Adjustment doesn't particularly like serving as a design review body, and it's not a path that that OP is promoting at this time. However, there has been research, as you alluded to, about what other cities have done. We don't have these tools in DC right now, but a design district can be established, a regulatory legislative process that establishes a design review process that can establish design guidelines and make them regulatory, establish a design body that would review for some of the more subjective aspects that go into design. That could be done with the express purpose of promoting certain city goals, such as the maximization of the creation of affordable housing, sustainability goals, relation to sort of community character, retail frontage, that sort of thing. Again, we don't have that tool right now, but we're having conversations in-house about that idea, not specifically for Chevy Chase, but citywide, that this could be something that could be helpful in giving an added dimension to encouraging sort of development that we want to see, as well as achieving the goals that we want to see from that development.
So depending on one's perspective on whether we want more or less design regulation, we could support that legislation or be afraid of it, I suppose.
Exactly.
Thank you. Let me ask Robert Gordon and Carl Lankowski, who I hope have been monitoring the Q&A and have their own questions. If you could join us, and Carl, turn your camera on and join the conversation, whichever of you wants to go first.
Carl?
Robert, you want to go or do you want me to go?
Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm almost delighted to be here tonight. I say almost because, like some of you, I've been immersed in the Ukrainian tragedy unfolding before our eyes. But, you know, the best antidote to Putinism is the kind of bottom-up community building in which we're participating here and now. My comments reflect personal opinions. I'm here representing Historic Chevy Chase DC, an organization founded 31 years ago out of love for our neighborhood and whose mission is education and preservation. I like to think of HCCDC as the neighborhood's collective memory. And over the past decade, our agenda has evolved beyond architecture and streetscapes to include the people that have lived here and still live here. That interest includes those that weren't excluded as well, segregated by design, even driven away so that a white enclave could be developed. that legacy still haunts. We took pains to know that history for a reason, to establish a point of reference to improve our community going forward. And I believe we must be guided by a vision of community that reflects the diversity of our city, a vibrant place that includes a truer cross-section of backgrounds by income and race in particular than is currently the case. Signaling this desire, seems to me, is indispensable. Therefore, we enthusiastically embrace the small area plan as an opportunity for all the residents of our neighborhood and other interested parties to reimagine the Connecticut Avenue corridor with a view to broadly reconnecting with the city we love and depend on for our livelihoods, and to do so with a medium to long-term planning horizon. The small area plan offers a chance to accept responsibility for challenges we face together as a city. Two critical ones are responding to the housing shortage and meeting the challenge of decarbonizing our way of life. Tonight, I'm going to focus on the first of these. So I approach.
Carl, there's a question here somewhere, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I approach the desirability of a historic district from the point of view of how this mechanism would contribute to the vision I've just described. So with this in mind, I have a few questions for our esteemed panel, just three. The first is, what signal would the creation of a historic district send about the goal of diversity? The second, more specifically, is how could a historic district help us create affordable dwellings? And third, even more specifically, are there ways that a historic district can be defined for, say, the west side of Connecticut Avenue that might accommodate taller buildings with suitable step downs, of course, to blend in with the residents behind them? So those are the three questions that I have specifically for the panel.
And I think your last question is that's what design guidelines need to cover, as to how development, redevelopment, additional density, and additions and new construction can take place within whatever the boundaries of the historic district would be. In terms of your first question about what signal would the creation of an historic district create in terms of diversity, I think, again, if the goal of the historic district is to protect the character of the historic district of the community that you all feel is valuable, while acknowledging that there's also room for growth and change and evolution, then you're sort of getting the best of both worlds in preserving something that people generally say that they treasure and like, but that while also acknowledging the important goals of racial equity as well as sustainability and other city goals that, you know, were not envisioned and were not considered when the neighborhood was first created. I mean, the thing about an historic district is that it, you know, these are old neighborhoods that have evolved and changed, some more than others. I live in a neighborhood that has gone through tremendous racial change several times in its 120, 140 years. Houses have been subdivided up from single family to SROs, single room occupancy during World War II, to flats, to 4-unit condos, immensely malleable buildings, reflecting the demographic changes within the neighborhood. So I think historic buildings can do that within the context of historic designation. And I've forgotten your second question.
Actually, can I talk about the first question a little bit? What signal would it send about diversity? I mean, I think the historic district documentation is a really good opportunity for you to get that story out there. I mean, you have done, HCC DC has done an amazing job researching the African-American community around Broad Branch Road and the Pointer Lafayette renaming the Pointer Lafayette Park is fantastic. And that really is an opportunity. It's been an opportunity to let people know about the broader history of Chevy Chase. But the historic district nomination can do the same thing, and it can uncover more information and can get that information out there to the public. And so rather than, I think your implication is that basically we're sending the signal that we're designating a white affluent neighborhood as Chevy Chase, but that's completely not true. We're telling a fuller story, a broader story about the history of Chevy Chase, and actually opening up designation to a more diverse understanding of what Chevy Chase is and was. So I think, you know, it's a good beginning to help tell that story.
And Chaz, maybe I could just also add, I mean, I think that, you know, as a social scientist who most of my work is around housing, and my interest in preservation sort of stemmed from my interest in housing. I think that, you know, one of the things that Carl's question points to is, you know, the fact that a lot of things are going on in this neighborhood at a similar time, right? So there are questions about how can you increase density in a neighborhood that creates affordable housing opportunities, right? There are questions around how we work with landlords, especially in wealthy neighborhoods like Chevy Chase, right, that deny voucher holders opportunities to live in those neighborhoods for reasons of race, for reasons of family size, for reasons of voucher status, right? So I think you know, the goals that Carl outlined of thinking about how we create communities that are diverse, that create, you know, that have housing for lots of different kinds of families, right? Different family sizes, different incomes. I don't think that those goals are necessarily incompatible. I don't think that they're incompatible with historic preservation, right? Which is largely about the sort of aesthetics or the buildings of a community. And I think that, you know, as you're doing, as this group is doing, this is an opportunity to see multiple processes happening at the same time, right? The planning process, the preservation process, thinking about development sites where you might increase density and build affordable housing, opportunities for a group like this to work with landlords in the neighborhood to better understand the voucher program and create opportunities for low-income families to move into, right? I mean, your neighborhood is one of the highest opportunity neighborhoods in the whole city, right? So I would just say that, you know, it's not a, you know, it's not a binary, right? It's a lot of processes happening, and I think that these issues that are being raised are really important ones. They're not incompatible with historic preservation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Carl. Robert, do you got a different question or a different point?
Yeah, I should have gone before Carl. He stole some of my thunder. Just by background, the Chevy Chase Citizens Association is a 110-year-old organization. We strongly support income and racial equality and diversity in our neighborhood and policies that support that. So my first question is for Kim and Steve. What is and you may have answered part of this, what is the likely effect of historic designation on Connecticut Avenue and residential streets?
On Connecticut Avenue and the residential streets.
Yes.
So if Chevy Chase, a broader area of Chevy Chase, including the residential neighborhood and Connecticut Avenue, were designated as a historic district, it means that it would be protected by the historic preservation law, which means that any alterations, additions, new construction would be reviewed to see that they're compatible with the character of the historic district. So, you know, we would be reviewing according to the historic district guidelines that we developed. And so the implications would be that there would be a review process, public engagement, an opportunity for the public to weigh in on proposals that come before the community in terms of how they affect their relationship to historic preservation, the historic district.
What can be done to make Chevy Chase more appealing to lower income families under historic designation?
I don't know how to answer that question. It's not the goal of historic preservation to to promote any sort of use or housing type. It's primarily a process that preserves the building stock, but that building stock can be altered and can be adapted for contemporary uses.
Well, the small area plan was originally considered by the ANC, and part of that was to ensure that more affordable housing was available in Chevy Chase. We are behind that, and we'd like to see that the small area plan respects that and also respects design considerations if there is no historic district. How do you respond to that?
We'll have to see what the specific recommendations end up being in the final draft as to the types of design review and zoning changes that are being put forth, and how those would affect building regulation in terms of design and relationship to community character.
Can we get the SAP to have a section that says something to the effect that historic designation will be considered? Because the SAP is going to be passed by the city council, will have the effect of law. And we would like to see that historic designation is at least considered as part of the SAP and put into the text of that.
Yeah, I mean, the draft SAP already acknowledges that there are historic buildings, there's a historic character that is intended to be maintained as part of the SAP process. But you know, unless you're a designated historic district, there's no review or control over the development that can occur in a designated area. So that's the difference. I mean, the small area plan can recognize the historic character and appreciate that historic character in Chevy Chase, but it doesn't, there's no opportunity to review any new development in terms of historic preservation and compatibility with the historic character if it's not a designated historic district.
Well, I think that's my question is, can the SAP at least note that the community is interested in a broader historic district designation, and that should be something that's looked at and evaluated in the future. So I'm not talking about specific historic buildings like the Avalon or the Arcade, but a more broad brush look at the community.
The SAP is the language that we've seen recognize. First of all, it's focused on the commercial area. It doesn't go beyond that, and it focuses on the comments that we've heard at the various community outreach events that have taken place, in which we have certainly heard that there is interest in the character of the west side of Connecticut Avenue, and whether or not the community decides to pursue designation for that specifically or not is ultimately up to the community. But it certainly acknowledges that that was an important concern expressed by many people.
This is a question for Dr. McCabe. In your book, No Place Like Home, you gave a number of examples of communities that struggled between preservation advocates that sought to maintain the historic character of their neighborhoods and minimize construction. And that was opposed to those who wanted equitable growth for affordable housing. As an example, in this neighborhood, as a matter of right, a developer can buy the property the American City Diner sits on and build a 6-story building that could be aesthetically out of character with the neighborhood. How as a neighborhood can we avoid discriminatory policies you might call NIMBY policies while ensuring that new construction fits in with the uniqueness of the neighborhood?
Yeah, Robert, that's a big question. So, you know, my book, I'm sort of interested in, the book you reference is about the politics of home ownership and thinking about sort of how it is and why it is that homeowners engage in their communities. And, you know, so we can think about, you know, the residential stability. Homeowners tend to live in their neighborhoods for a long period of time, right? And they take an interest in those neighborhoods as a result of being residentially stable. We can also think that homeowners take an interest in their neighborhood because of the, you know, the financial benefits of doing it, right? That building wealth through housing is one of the, is the primary way that people build wealth in America, and especially middle class and wealthy people. And so neighbors get involved in communities as a way to protect their property values, right? And so one of the things that I look at in the book is sort of efforts to keep certain kinds of land uses out of neighborhoods as a tool for protecting property values. So that said, I mean, I think that, you know, this kind of forum and the work that the Historic Preservation Office and the Office of Planning are doing are exactly the kinds of work that need to be done, right? And part of that is, I think, valuing the voices of a diverse set of people in the communities. One of the, you know, the concerns that's often raised about home ownership and homeowners is that the voices of homeowners are heard sort of above and beyond the voices of other residents. When in fact, sort of everybody that lives in a community has a stake in the direction of it, right? And that includes renters and homeowners, people that have lived there just for a short period of time, and people that have lived there for a really long period of time, right? All have sort of valid claims to the neighborhood. So, you know, I don't have a great answer to that, but I think, you know, these kinds of forums where people can have sort of honest conversations about what they want for their neighborhood or what they fear for their neighborhood, right? The kinds of things that worry them about change in the neighborhood in these forums is sort of the, you know, the way that I would move forward.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Carl, the point came up that you may remember better than I do, but we had a session last spring at HCC DC with some people who talked about the economics of affordable housing from the developer's perspective, and sort of how people figure out how much affordable housing they can afford. As I recollect, you know, there was a narrow space where the economics of a private building, as opposed to the potential for the two public buildings that are being considered on Connecticut Avenue. But for a private developer, the affordable housing window is very narrow, as I recollect. Do you remember more about what that conversation was? It seems relevant here. Not to give you a quiz on the 6-month-old.
It was a long time ago, too.
Yeah. Any event, well, what I would do, I would urge people to look at the HCCD website if you're interested in this topic. And an event we did last April and May, I believe, where we had a gentleman from North Carolina who was a housing finance expert who talked about some of these issues. We have a problem in that it's almost to the end of our time, and I haven't had any lot of space to get questions from the audience. But looking at those questions, I don't know, Connie, if you've been monitoring them and can prioritize any to pose to our group here. I guess, you know, there's several questions about the details of a historic designation, the design plans, and I guess that's something that I heard you folks from HPO say gets developed after the application. There are design guidelines on your website for a couple of your existing historic districts, I think, that people can look at to see the kinds of things that go into the details of a historic district. Are there any other ways for people to get into the nitty gritty of what goes into those, or what's the range of things in the district?
I mean, I think, you know, we're always happy to come out to the community to give a presentation on you know, what it means to be in a historic district, and if it were a historic district, you know, what you know, might be approvable or not approvable in terms of new work on an existing building. We want to get information out to people in advance so that they can, sort of decide how they feel about the notion of historic district designation. And so, I think, I'm always available, willing, and happy to come out and talk to the community.
Super. There was a question about the timing of the small area plan. And I know that we had a briefing on this at the ANC recently, and I'm going to remember it imperfectly, so one of my colleagues can correct me. But basically, their charge is to finish up their public consultation process at this stage and do a draft pretty quickly. And sometime over the summer, that would become finalized and put out for review again. It has to go to the mayor, I guess, at some point, late summer, early fall, for consideration there. Is that a fair representation of the general time frame?
Correct.
And
Yeah.
and if a historic district application landed on your desk tomorrow morning, what's the mean time to your completion of your review?
So again, that's a multi-level process in terms of our review of the technical aspect of the application and going out to the public and making sure there's been adequate outreach and answering questions. And so usually by the time an application gets to us, that public outreach effort is well along in the process. So I wouldn't anticipate having an application on our desk in the next day, but by the time we get it, I would say 6 months is generally a good turnaround by the time a nomination gets to the Historic Preservation Review Board. So if we receive a nomination and it's all in order from a technical perspective, there's been a lot of public outreach, there seems to be broad, good community support, and it's coming from the public, then usually about 6 months before it will get a hearing.
Can I press you a little bit on that, Kim? How do you determine this broad community support? In the last exercise we had, the ANC actually conducted a mail ballot poll, but that's not required and not your usual practice, I don't think.
Yeah, so I sort of want to retract that statement of broad community support, because it's impossible for us to really determine that. We don't take a vote, and we are just sort of assuming that the applicants who have done that or who are bringing it forward to us have garnered that support and believe there is that support. If it appears, before it even gets to a hearing, we're getting nothing but opposition from the community, then it may be, a time for us to question the applicants. Are you sure you have support from your community? And so, we give great weight to the ANC. Historic Preservation Review Board will give great weight to the ANC when it comes up for a hearing. But, I think obviously you're going to get opposition from a community, but if there is evidence of support, and obviously the application is written and addresses the criteria and it meets the criteria, then there could be good reason for going forward to a hearing, even if there seems to be opposition, but there is also support. So it's not scientific. We can't.
Right, and that hearing is a public hearing where people can appear and participate as well.
Correct.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
The most important thing that the review board wants to see is that people aren't surprised and don't know about it. So there needs to be a broad community awareness of the proposal. And then if there is opposition, it's interesting for us to look at, okay, what is the nature of the opposition? Is it based on, I don't know enough about this to be able to, or I'm opposed to it because I don't understand it. Well, okay, that means that we need to help with doing some outreach and education and things like developing the design guidelines. Will that answer people's questions? One of the things that the review board noticed in the Bloomingdale nomination was that some of the support, or some of the opposition rather, was based on clear misconceptions that had been addressed time and time again in community meetings and in writing in the development guidelines, and the board said it, on the dais. We're not going to do that to you. That's not the result of this designation. And so making sure that there's a good factual understanding of both the proposal and the implications of the proposal are important for the board to see.
Super. We're coming up on our time, but Carl or Robert, any other questions you've got? I've been reading through the Q&A and the since I couldn't do that earlier, but there's a lot of questions we haven't answered yet. I think we don't have answers to, and I think what we ought to endeavor to do is to see if I can get the cooperation of our panelists to maybe get some answers to those we can put on our website at the same time as we post some of the rest of these things. Because they're all good questions. But Robert,
Yeah.
Carl?
Yeah, I would just want to thank our panelists for doing an outstanding job this evening, and also more broadly for the ANC for having put together just a really first-class series of information exchanges. So thank you very much.
And I echo what Carl just said. Thank you so much, panelists. Very educational.
Our three experts, any last thoughts, or what's the headline we should put at the top of our description of your contribution? Or we can do that ourselves. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I do want to thank each of you for your time and your expertise. And I hope that the sum of tonight starts some conversation, but also makes clearer to people how these two related but not perfectly interlocked processes work, and how and where we have voice in the look and feel of our community going ahead. So I want to thank Steve Callcott and Kim Williams and Brian McCabe, and also Robert and Carl for your support in doing this and for joining us. But mostly, I guess, I want to thank all of you who are in the audience here. We had 59 people at one point, I think, which is a measure of the interest in this topic. And also, of course, thank my colleague Connie for keeping us all visible and live. We are going to end here, and we're going to stay online for a minute because we have to capture the chat and the Q&A. But both of these processes, the SAP process and the neighborhood consideration of various options for a historic district, are live conversations. So I don't think this will be the last event that either the ANC or the Citizens Association or the Historic Chevy Chase DC end up having on these topics. So with that, let me thank everybody for your participation, and we will conclude. All this will be on the website in a couple of days.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you all again. Tony, are you able to capture